faggot I see out here. He's probably somewhere sucking somebody's dick.
There is a man whose face has appeared on American screens more than 200 times in films that shaped the way a generation understood itself, and who was told more than once by the industry responsible for putting him there that his skin was too dark for the role they had in mind. At 70 years old, Clifton Powell carries a filmography that most working actors in Hollywood would need several lifetimes to assemble. He has played menacing men, comic men, tragic men, and once, quietly, without the fanfare the decision deserved, one of the most recognizable human beings who ever lived. He has done this while carrying a voice that 50 million people around the world know by heart, spoken through a character in a video game, even when they cannot place his name to a single film he has ever made. And yet the conversation about who Clifton Powell actually is, what he gave to the screen across 40 years, and what the screen withheld from him in return, is one that Hollywood has never quite been willing to finish. This is that conversation, told through the roles you remember, and the ones that were never offered to him at all. Stay with it. The applause for a performance like his rarely names the man giving it, and that quiet arithmetic would define nearly everything that came after. The 200 credits were still decades away when the story actually begins, in a place most of the country never bothered to look at closely. Mayfair Mansion sat in northeast Washington, D.C., near the Anacostia River, in a part of the city that the rest of the city did not always choose to see. It was not a neighborhood built for comfort. It was built for people. Dense, vivid, demanding people who understood early that a man's worth in that part of town was measured by what he built with his own hands, not by what the world was prepared to hand him. The sound of Mayfair Mansions was the sound of a Sunday morning church service down the block, and a basketball hitting asphalt 2 courts over, and someone's mother calling a name out a window that had been left open on purpose. Marvin Gaye grew up in this same neighborhood a few years before Clifton Powell did. It is not a connection between the two men. It is a fact about the place. A place that seemed to produce artists the way other neighborhoods produced athletes, as an answer to everything the wider world had already decided about what a boy from Northeast DC was worth. Clifton Powell was born on March 16, 1956 in Washington, D.C. to Naomi and Ashford Powell. The family was large. Some sources place the number of siblings as high as 12, though the specifics of that household are not fully documented, and what remains clearest is the picture around it. A boy raised inside a big, loud, occupied home in a housing development that asked its children to grow up fast and pay attention. The early dream was football. He is on record saying so himself, in a conversation years later on the podcast Pierre's Panic Room, that before anything else, he wanted to be a football player. It made sense for a boy from that neighborhood in that decade. Football offered a stage with rules everyone already understood, a way to make the body mean something in public, a path that had been walked before by other boys from other blocks like his. He attended high school first at H.D. Woodson Senior High School and, by some accounts, later at DeMatha Catholic High School in Hyattsville, Maryland. The exact sequence of his early schooling is not perfectly consistent across the record, though the destination is. The shift happened at a school theater production. He saw a performance of My Fair Lady, and something in it stopped him. He asked the director if he could be part of a show. He was given the role of General Bull Moose in a production of Lil Abner. It was not a lead. It was not written to change a life. It is the kind of small role a boy from Mayfair Mansions gets when he walks through a door he was not expected to walk through. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The stage answered something the football field never had. From there, the path led to the Duke Ellington School of the Arts in Washington, D.C., where he graduated in 1978, an institution built for exactly the kind of person Powell was quietly becoming, whether he had a name for it yet or not. And then to Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, where the craft stopped being instinct and started becoming discipline. He arrived with the raw material of the stage and the streets already inside him. He left with the structure to carry both of them onto a camera and make them legible to an audience that had never met him. There is something worth sitting with in the specific distance between General Bull Moose and the roles that would eventually define his career. A comic, minor part in a high school production of Lil Abner, is about as far as a role can get from Chauncey's quiet treachery or Cuddy's raw menace. What connected them was never the character type. It was the discovery, made once and never unmade, that a stage, any stage, however small, was a place where a boy from Mayfair Mansions could make an entire room pay attention to him on his own terms, rather than the terms the neighborhood or the city had already decided for him. The place had formed him completely before the industry had found a name for what he was becoming. A career built on a foundation like that does not announce itself. It has to be earned one unglamorous credit at a time. His professional debut came in 1981 in the television movie Ephraim McDowell's Kentucky Ride, a small part, the kind of credit filed away in a resume rather than celebrated in a press release. This is where real careers begin, not in the light, in the work nobody is watching yet. Alphabet City followed in 1984, a small role in a gritty New York street picture, another line added to a growing but still quiet record. There was little in either credit that announced a future of any particular size. There was only a young actor trained at a Boston conservatory taking whatever the industry offered him and treating it with a seriousness the size of the part did not always seem to warrant. Then House Party in 1990, a film with genuine cultural weight behind it, a black audience that showed up in force, a frame in which Powell's particular energy could begin to register with the people who would spend the next 3 decades watching for him. Deep Cover in 1992 gave him a supporting role in a crime drama that critics and audiences actually noticed, and it sharpened the signal. Roles requiring moral complexity and physical presence fit Clifton Powell the way few actors of his generation could be fitted. These were not the credits of a man being discovered overnight. They were the credits of a man being confirmed, one careful performance at a time, by people in the industry who were beginning to take notice even if the wider public had not yet caught up. What distinguished him even then was not volume, it was the threat of volume, the specific difference between a man who is loud and a man whose stillness suggests he does not need to be. He came to be described in time by the shorthand that would follow him for the rest of his career. An actor who speaks in threatening whispers. That is not a personality trait. It is a studied instrument, built out of an understanding he likely absorbed long before he ever stood in front of a camera, that the most dangerous person in a room is often the quietest one in it. The years between his 1981 debut and his 1993 breakthrough were a decade of persistent, unglamorous labor. Guest spots, small parts in films not everyone saw, a career assembled brick by brick without a publicist clearing the path, without a franchise carrying him forward, without a studio's promotional machine doing any of the work for him. What those years permanently installed in him was a specific discipline. The understanding that an actor without the lead has to make every single moment count completely, because there may be no second scene in which to prove who this person is. That is a different kind of performance than the one a leading man is asked to give. It requires a full investment compressed into a few minutes of screen time, and Powell had been quietly rehearsing exactly that kind of concentrated intelligence since before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. What he had built by the early 1990s was not yet a career the industry could fully see. It was, however, a career the industry would very soon be unable to look away from. And being noticed, it would turn out, was never the same thing as being let in. Being seen fully and being welcomed fully are not always the same thing, and Clifton Powell would learn that distinction from the inside, in a series of specific rooms he could name if he chose to. It is worth understanding what those years actually cost in practical terms, beyond the general idea of being overlooked. Every role turned down on the basis of complexion is a role some other actor received instead, a credit that belongs in the historical record to somebody else's resume. Every project that never materialized because a network decided in advance that Powell's face carried too much weight is a body of work the public will never get to see and can never fully weigh against what he did get to make. The absence itself becomes part of the record, even though it leaves no visible trace on any poster or any awards ballot. The barrier was not a lack of talent. It was not a lack of work or dedication or range. It was the color of his skin, stated to him plainly, more than once, by the people who held the keys to the rooms he wanted to walk into. In a documented interview, Powell put it without ceremony. If y'all knew how many movies I had, people come to me and they say, well, you should be bigger than you are. Well, if I tell you how many times they said I was too black for the role, you wouldn't believe it. He went further, describing a specific encounter over a major film, one large enough, he has said, that it could have taken his career to another level entirely, in which a network told the producer directly, "We think he's so dark, he's gonna scare everybody." That sentence did not arrive at the start of his career, when a decision like that might at least carry the excuse of unfamiliarity. It arrived at a point when his talent was not in question, when his range across genre and tone had already been proven on screen, when the resume alone should have made the decision obvious. The network said no anyway, not because of anything he had done, because of what he looked like doing it. This is not a historical grievance recovered from a distant era of the industry. This is the plainly stated, on-the-record working life of a dark-skinned black actor building one of the most prolific careers any American character actor of his generation would assemble, while being told in a specific meeting about a specific film that his face was too much of a face for an audience the network had already decided it understood. Powell has been careful in later interviews to place this experience inside a wider pattern rather than treat it as an isolated insult. He has pointed to other well-documented instances of complexion-based casting decisions across the industry. Reports, for example, that a major agency once instructed its clients not to submit any black actor whose skin was darker than Denzel Washington's for certain roles. He has connected that pattern to a much larger observation about how visibility and acceptability have been quietly measured across American public life, not only inside a casting office. This was never, in his telling, a single wound delivered by a single villain. It was a system with its own internal logic, operating the same way in one room after another, year after year, largely without needing to explain itself. No amount of craft could undo that particular math. Powell could walk into any room in the industry and give a performance the room would not forget. He could do it across genre, crime drama, comedy, historical drama, voice work, horror, action. He could hold menace and humanity in the same scene without either one canceling the other. None of that could change what a network executive saw when he looked at Clifton Powell's face and decided it was too present, too dark, too threatening for an audience that had never actually been asked. What the barrier permanently installed instead was a ferocity of output. Powell did not slow down. He worked harder, and he took the roles that were actually offered to him, and he made each one impossible to dismiss, until the question of what might have been given to him became far less interesting than the plain record of what he built without it. What came after that reckoning was not the same man who had walked in believing talent alone would be enough. The industry's next answer arrived, unglamorously enough, in the form of a debut feature from two brothers still in their early 20s. Menace II Society premiered in the summer of 1993, directed by Albert and Alan Hughes in their feature debut, and it announced without apology that Black American cinema was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to tell the truth about the streets it had grown up inside of. Powell's role was Chauncey, a jealous, treacherous man whose decision to turn in a videotape of a liquor store shooting to the police out of resentment rather than conscience sets off one of the film's central moral catastrophes. He is not the protagonist. He is not the film's most violent figure. He is something quieter and, in its way, more unsettling. A man moved by petty jealousy who causes irreversible harm without ever raising his voice to do it. What Chauncey demanded of Powell was the ability to make a man doing nothing spectacular feel more dangerous than every man around him doing something loud. It required playing not menace, but the seed that grows into betrayal, the small, specific resentment that looks like nothing at all until it detonates. He played it without excess. He played it true. And audiences who saw the film in theaters in 1993 have not forgotten the way that stillness worked on them. 2 years later, the Hughes brothers brought him back for Dead Presidents in 1995, casting him as Cuddy, a menacing, unrelenting presence in a story about Vietnam veterans returning home to an America that had built no place ready to receive them. The register here was entirely different from Chauncey, louder, more physically immediate, a villain drawn in broader strokes, and it proved something important about the actor delivering it. The whisper was one instrument. It was never the only one he had. What these two films gave Powell was a credibility inside the specific world of 1990s Black American cinema that no quantity of direct-to-video work could have purchased for him. The Hughes brothers had made films that mattered, films critics took seriously and audiences returned to for decades, films that would eventually be spoken of as essential American cinema rather than simply essential Black cinema. To have been remembered inside both of them was the beginning of a reputation. It was not a guarantee of anything more. It was, at last, a foundation solid enough to build on. It is worth pausing on what that foundation actually consisted of, because it was narrower than it might sound from a distance. A reputation built on Chauncey and Cuddy was a reputation built specifically around menace and moral complexity, around a very particular register of performance that the industry could now name and, having named it, could reach for again and again. That reach would prove generous over the following decade. It would also prove, in its own way, confining, narrowing the range of the calls that came in, even as the number of calls themselves increased. What he brought to that foundation was everything the quiet years had taught him, every guest appearance, every unremarkable supporting role, every moment of learning to make a scene count when no one was watching for him yet. None of it had been wasted. All of it walked onto the set of Menace to Society with him, inside the specific economy of stillness that Chauncey's silence demanded from a man who had spent over a decade learning exactly how to be still. A foundation like that does not simply hold weight. It starts drawing more of it. By the end of the decade, Clifton Powell was no longer a discovery. He was becoming a fixture, the kind of presence audiences began to expect and, increasingly, to look forward to. Rush Hour arrived in 1998, an enormous mainstream Hollywood action comedy, with Powell in the ensemble as Luke, a different register again from the Hughes brothers' work, commercial and broad. Another room added to a career being built without a blueprint. That same year brought Why Do Fools Fall in Love?, a biographical film about the 1950s rock and roll star Frankie Lyman and the three women who fought over his estate after his death. A world of grief, music, and legal combat that gave Powell yet another register to inhabit. Then, in 2000, came Next Friday, directed by Steve Carr, with Powell cast as Pinky. This was not the whispered menace of Chauncey or the raw physicality of Cuddy. Pinky is theatrical, loud, an old-school gangster who has outlasted his own era through sheer force of personality, and who is, underneath the performance, genuinely, deliberately funny. Powell was not simply doing comedy here. He was playing a man who had learned to weaponize laughter as a means of control, and the layers underneath that choice are what made Pinky a character audiences kept returning to. Friday After Next brought the role back in 2002, and by then the character had a life of his own, independent of the actor who had built him. Across this period, Powell was moving through crime drama, biographical narrative, mainstream Hollywood comedy, and urban comedy almost simultaneously, and in nearly every one of them, he was the performance audiences carried home and talked about. Not the lead, not the name above the title, the one people remembered when the credits rolled and the lights came back up. That is the specific contradiction of the working character actor at the very height of his power. He is indispensable to the scene. He is often the reason the scene works at all. And by the industry's own accounting, he remains a supporting figure, his name below the title, his face absent from the center of the poster. Even in the exact moments when no one else in the frame is doing what he is doing. That contradiction does not resolve itself with time or with more credits. It becomes the architecture the rest of the career gets built inside of. Consider what it takes to be memorable inside somebody else's story over and over for 30 years running. A lead actor gets 2 hours to build a character, scene after scene, with the full attention of the camera and the script both working in his favor. A supporting actor at Powell's level of consistency gets a fraction of that time and is still expected every single time to leave a mark the audience carries out of the theater. That is not a lesser skill practiced by a lesser artist. It is a harder skill, refined under harder conditions by an actor who had already spent a decade in the unglamorous years learning exactly how to do it. That architecture had a philosophy underneath it, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. Clifton Powell is a physically commanding man. He occupies a frame the way large men do, completely without effort. And when a physically commanding man chooses to lower his voice, not out of fear, but out of the calculated understanding that a whisper carries further than a shout ever could, the effect on a camera and on the audience watching it is something that is very hard to look away from. The audience does not pull back from a whispering man the way it instinctively pulls back from a shouting one. It leans in. It moves closer to the danger, voluntarily, because the performance has created a pull it cannot quite name and does not particularly want to resist. Powell seems to have understood this mechanism early, perhaps from Mayfair Mansions itself, where the quietest men in a room were sometimes the ones who had the most reason to be quiet, and he turned that understanding into a professional instrument sharpened over years rather than discovered in a single lucky take. The whisper is not passivity, it is control. It is the performance of a man who has decided that power does not require advertisement, that authority is expressed most completely not by the volume at which it enters a room, but by the certainty with which it holds its position inside that room once it has arrived. A character who whispers is a character who already knows how the scene ends. He does not need to raise his voice because the outcome was never actually in question. That instrument came at a cost. An actor who excels at menace, at moral complexity, at the performance of contained and unsettling intelligence, working inside a Hollywood still deciding what black actors were permitted to be at the center of its most commercially visible films, becomes an actor whose specific gift gets called on again and again for one particular kind of role. The range Powell demonstrated across 40 years, the calculated comedy of Pinky, the gravity of a man carrying the weight of Martin Luther King Jr. Quote's name and cadence, the quiet, carrying grief of a road manager standing beside a musical genius, was always present, always available. It was not always requested. The industry was not wrong about what it saw when it cast him. It was, again and again, incomplete. What that reduction cost him is not measured in any single credit. It is measured in everything the full instrument never got asked to do. The leading roles never written with him in mind. The romantic pictures. The prestige dramas built around a man carrying an entire film's emotional center rather than anchoring a single unforgettable scene within somebody else's. None of that absence shows up on a resume. All of it shows up, quietly, in the shape of the career that exists instead. There was a stretch of years, though, when nearly everything he was capable of got asked of him at once. In 1999, Walt Disney Television produced Selma Lord, Selma for ABC, directed by Charles Burnett, and Powell was cast as Martin Luther King Jr. The Philadelphia Tribune singled out his performance specifically. Playing King requires an actor to carry not just a character, but a symbol, a voice the entire country already has memorized, a historical weight the audience brings into the room before the first line is even spoken, in a production that will air on a major network on a night when everyone watching already knows exactly how the story ends. The danger in a role like that is simplification, flattening a man into a monument. Powell avoided it. He found the man underneath the monument. And the distance between those two choices is the entire difference between a performance that is endured out of respect and one that is genuinely remembered. 5 years later came Woman Thou Art Loosed in 2004, with Powell cast as Reggie, a predatory, morally reprehensible figure whose actions against a child sit at the center of the film's moral argument. This is the kind of role certain actors decline outright, where the character's ugliness is too total and the audience's revulsion too certain. Powell did not decline it. He made Reggie comprehensible without excusing a single thing he did, because the film's argument required exactly that. The understanding that cruelty is rarely a caricature, that it is usually a person who appears, in most other rooms, to be something else entirely. That same stretch of years brought Civil Brand, for which Powell won Best Actor, with the film itself winning Best Film at the American Black Film Festival South Beach. This was not a minor recognition tucked into an industry trade paper. It was a community of black filmmakers and critics stating plainly that the work mattered, and that his performance sat at its center. The honor arrived quietly, without a studio's promotional machinery pushing it toward a wider audience, arriving, as much of Powell's most significant work has arrived, entirely on its own terms. And then, in 2004, came Ray, directed by Taylor Hackford and starring Jamie Foxx, with Powell cast as Jeff Brown, Ray Charles's longtime road manager. It was here that a formal industry citation finally sat beside his name, a nomination for the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Motion Picture. In a film built around one of the most celebrated figures in American music, Clifton Powell was the man who made the surrounding world feel true, the loyal, complicated presence keeping everything running, while the genius at the center did the performing the world had come to see. Every one of those roles required something of the man once the cameras stopped. Powell has spoken, in workshops and public appearances since, about the discipline it takes to invest fully in a character's darkness for the length of a shoot, and then leave that darkness behind on the set when the day ends. That discipline is rarely discussed in the same breath as the performances it makes possible. Audiences remember Reggie's cruelty in Woman Thou Art Loosed, or the quiet devotion of Jeff Brown in Ray. They do not see the hours afterward, the deliberate unwinding required to set a character like that down and walk back into an ordinary evening as himself. That is its own kind of labor, invisible by design, and it does not appear on any call sheet. The achievement in those years was entirely real. The cost of reaching it was real as well, and neither one erased the other. There was a life waiting for him outside of all of it, one that the public record only ever glimpsed in careful pieces. Powell is married to Kimberly Powell, a designer and chef, and the two are reported to have met before he became a recognizable public figure, which means she knew the man before the career arrived to redefine, in the eyes of strangers, who he was. That is a specific and particular kind of partnership, one that carries its own private knowledge the public record was never entitled to. Together they have 2 children. Clifton Powell Jr. attended the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he played basketball, and in 2022, he drew public attention for a relationship with Sasha Obama, the youngest daughter of former President Barack Obama. Powell Sr. has spoken publicly about offering his son guidance on handling that kind of sudden, unfamiliar visibility. A father who has spent his entire working life managing the specific, imperfect texture of public recognition, one that rarely comes bundled with real protection, passing what he had learned onto a son whose own visibility had arrived through an entirely different door. That is not a small thing to offer someone. It is an entire education compressed into a handful of reported conversations. There is a particular kind of knowledge in that exchange between father and son. Powell had spent decades being recognized on a street corner and unable to translate that recognition into the protections that come standard with a different tier of fame. His son, at a much younger age, found himself recognized for reasons that had nothing to do with a body of work at all, recognized simply for who he was seen standing beside. A father who understood the gap between being known and being safeguarded by that knowing was, in that specific moment, exactly the right person to have in the room. His daughter, Maya Powell, referred to in some sources as May Powell, has largely kept her own life outside of the public record, and it belongs to her to tell if she ever chooses to. That restraint, in a family whose patriarch has spent 40 years in front of cameras, is its own quiet statement about what the Powells have decided to share with the world and what they have decided, just as deliberately, to keep for themselves. The couple also has 2 grandchildren, Eliza and Rashad Jr., extending a story that began in Mayfair mansions in the 1950s into a generation that will come to know Powell's name and face and voice not from a theater seat, but from a screen in a room, in a world he could not have fully predicted the day he was handed the small role of General Bull Moose in a school production and quietly decided that this, whatever it was the thing. The particular fame Powell has lived with for 4 decades is not the fame of a leading man, with its managed narratives and its security details and its machinery built to insulate a famous face from the direct consequences of being known. It is the fame of being stopped on a street by someone who says, "I know you from somewhere," and means it completely, and still cannot quite produce the name. That somewhere is 100 different films, 3 different decades, and a video game that sold tens of millions of copies to people who have never sat in a movie theater to watch him work at all. That last part of the story did not arrive according to anyone's plan, and it changed the shape of everything that came before it. In October of 2004, Rockstar Games released Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which would become one of the best-selling video games in the history of the medium. Powell voiced Melvin Big Smoke Harris, a character introduced as a loyal friend and revealed over the course of the game's story to be one of its central betrayers. The arc mirrors the exact kind of performance Powell had been delivering on film screens for over a decade by that point. A man who appears to be one thing and is slowly, carefully revealed to be another. The stillness, the measured delivery, the sense that something is being withheld until the moment it can do the most damage. What happened next was not something anyone at that recording session could have planned for. San Andreas became a cultural phenomenon that reached far past the video game industry itself. A work of sharp American satire, of street-level specificity in its music and language and geography that sold tens of millions of copies and has continued circulating for 2 decades since through remastered editions, archival voice recordings, and an entire internet culture built around quoting it. Powell's voice, his particular delivery of Big Smoke's specific brand of philosophical betrayal, entered the memory of people on multiple continents who could not name a single film Clifton Powell has ever appeared in. His lines have been repeated by people who were not alive when Menace II Society opened in theaters. His voice lives inside a generation that first encountered it not in a theater seat, but on a screen in a bedroom, in a country he may never have set foot in himself. There is a specific, uncomfortable poetry in that. The American film industry told Clifton Powell in a specific room about a specific film that he was so dark he would frighten an audience. The video game industry gave that same voice to one of the most played characters in the history of the medium, and the world did not flinch. It listened. 2 decades later, it is still listening. The irony does not resolve cleanly, and it should not be asked to. A voice reaching 50 million players does not repair a career denied to a man because a network decided his face was too much to look at for 2 hours. But it accomplished something the industry never anticipated and has no power to undo. It made Clifton Powell permanently, irreversibly known in a form the industry had no hand in creating and cannot revoke. What remained after that kind of reach was still the older, harder question the industry had never actually answered. Clifton Powell has never been the name above the title of a major Hollywood studio film. He has been inside those films. He has been inside a great many of them. He has, in scene after scene across 4 decades, been the reason a moment worked as well as it did. But the name above the title, the one carrying the film's commercial weight and the one the trade papers wrote about, belonged to somebody else. That was never an accident. It was the structural output of a system making ongoing decisions about who got to anchor a film and who got to support one. Decisions shaped in no small part by what an executive in a casting meeting believed an audience could tolerate looking at for 2 hours. What the supporting frame gave him in return was range, an extraordinary breadth of human experience explored across 4 decades of work. The ability to enter a character's entire interior during preparation for a role the audience might see for only 10 minutes of screen time, and to make those 10 minutes carry the full weight of everything he had built. That is its own form of mastery. It is not a consolation prize. It is a discipline few actors ever fully develop, because few actors are ever required to. What it withheld was the particular institutional recognition that follows a name synonymous with a film's commercial success. The awards campaigns a studio funds because it has decided a performance is worth funding. The public narrative of an entire career told in full, rather than assembled from the margins of other people's stories. There is no single villain to blame for that outcome, and the record does not support inventing one, however tempting a clean villain might be for the sake of a tidier story. No single studio executive, no single casting director, no single network programmer made the decision alone. It was the accumulated weight of many separate, smaller decisions, made across 4 decades by people who mostly never met each other, all arriving at roughly the same conclusion about what a face like Powell's was and was not permitted to lead. That is, in its own way, a harder thing to reckon with than a single villain would have been. There is no one meeting to point to, no one memo to hold up as the whole explanation. There is only the pattern itself, visible across 200 credits, plain enough that it no longer requires much argument. The honest accounting of it is this. Clifton Powell built one of the most prolific careers in the history of American character acting. More than 200 screen appearances, spanning nearly every genre across more than 4 decades, reaching from a housing development beside the Anacostia River to the streets of a fictional Los Santos and back again. The industry that told him he was too dark for a role still gave him a career most of the executives who said that could not have matched in their own most ambitious dreams. And the audience that actually received that career, the people who watched Pinky, who quoted Big Smoke, who remembered exactly how Chauncey's stillness made a scene feel true, gave him something the industry's own accounting has never found a proper category for: a permanent place inside the memory of an era. That kind of memory does not arrive from a press release or an industry campaign. It arrives from millions of individual, unpaid, unprompted decisions to remember a specific performance, made across decades by people who owed the actor nothing and gave him their attention anyway. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of correction the industry itself was never quite willing to issue on its own. For a long time, the industry's version of Clifton Powell was a simple one. He was the villain. He was the heavy. He was the man you called when you needed the room to feel dangerous. That description was not exactly wrong. It was radically incomplete. It missed the man who won Best Actor at the American Black Film Festival for Civil Brand. It missed the man whose performance as Martin Luther King Jr. earned specific praise from the Philadelphia Tribune. It missed the man who made Jeff Brown in Ray feel like a complete human being rather than a supporting note, a presence the film would have been genuinely diminished without. It missed the man who has spent years running acting workshops and film camps for young people, including Behind the Lens Actors Boot Camp and On the Set Summer Film Camp for youth between the ages of 8 and 18. Because he attended a workshop himself as a young man that changed the direction of his entire life, and he understood exactly what a single open door can do for someone standing where he once stood. The casting of dark-skinned black actors in American film and television across the 1990s and 2000s operated inside a specific, well-documented logic, one with clear ideas about which stories dark-skinned black men were permitted to anchor and which stories only required their presence in service of somebody else's arc. Powell did not build that logic. He worked inside it, and he made of it a great deal more than the logic itself had ever intended to allow. That same logic has been described publicly by other performers of his generation, in language that echoes Powell's own. Actors passed over, not for a lack of range, but for a surplus of complexion. Roles quietly reassigned to lighter-skinned performers considered more commercially palatable to audiences no one had actually consulted. Powell's account is not an outlier inside that history. It is one clear, specific, on-the-record data point inside a pattern that an entire generation of dark-skinned black actors lived through simultaneously, often without the public language to describe it in real time. As he put it plainly in his own words, "If I tell you the truth, I've been blocked from a lot of movies. One big movie, the network told the producer, 'We think he's so dark he's gonna scare everybody.' That statement does not ask for pity, it states the record." And the matter-of-fact way he says it is the specific quality of a man who has had 40 years to decide exactly how he intends to carry what was done to him. Powell himself has never framed his career as a story of pure grievance, and it would be a disservice to flatten it into one. He speaks, in most interviews, with more clarity than bitterness, naming what happened plainly and then moving almost immediately into what he built despite it. That balance is itself a kind of instruction, offered without ever being announced as one, to the younger actors who now sit in his workshops. There was a second, quieter misreading layered underneath the first. Powell was cast as the villain so consistently that some part of the industry's perception of him became circular. He was cast as the villain because that is what he played. And he played the villain because that is what he had been cast as. What the circularity obscured was the evidence sitting in plain sight. Every time a director or a script actually gave him something different to inhabit, he inhabited it completely. He was never a villain performer. He was a complete performer, placed most often in villain territory by an industry that had made a single decision about his face and kept making it. The record, looked at honestly, does not leave much room for the old, simpler story to survive. The career, meanwhile, simply kept going. Beginning in 2016, Powell took the role of Rex Fisher, the main antagonist on Bounce TV's Saints and Sinners, the network's first primetime original drama, appearing alongside Vanessa Bell Calloway and Gloria Rubin across 6 seasons that ran until 2022. It aired on a network built specifically for Black American audiences, a different ecosystem entirely from the Hollywood studio system that had once told him his darkness was a liability. Here, that same quality was the engine of the show. His sustained presence across a long-running television narrative gave him a kind of consistent, week-to-week visibility that a career built primarily from supporting film roles, by its very nature, is never quite able to sustain on its own. He continued into the streaming era with The Family Business on BET+, playing Uncle Lou Duncan, brother and partner to LC in the series' crime family drama. A role that carried him into a period when the landscape of Black American television had expanded into territory the networks of the 1990s never opened. In 2025, he appeared in BMF as Pastor Coleman and in The Family Business New Orleans, work that confirms what the record already made plain. At 70 years old, Clifton Powell has not stopped. He is still working, still appearing on screens, still finding new rooms inside a career that has been building itself, one credit at a time, for more than 4 decades. He also moved behind the camera, directing episodes of Chase Street between 2017 and 2020, a specific kind of arrival that requires an artist to understand not just his own instrument, but the entire orchestra surrounding it. Directing asks a different question of a performer than acting does. It asks him to see the whole shape of a scene rather than his own place inside of it. And Powell, after decades of studying how other directors built rooms around him, brought that accumulated understanding to the other side of the camera without hesitation, treating it as one more room in a career built out of rooms he had never been guaranteed entry into. He kept returning to the workshops too, to Behind the Lens Actors Boot Camp and to On the Set Summer Film Camp, teaching the architecture of filmmaking to children between the ages of 8 and 18, roughly the age he was himself when he walked into a school play and discovered in the small role of General Bull Moose that the stage belonged to him. He has spoken about why this work matters to him specifically, that a workshop opened a door for him once, when he did not yet have the language to explain what he was looking for, and that he intends to keep standing at that same kind of door for as long as he is able. He toured too with the inspirational stage production, Will a Real Man Please Stand Up?, carrying the theater back to its original form. Live, immediate, unmediated, after a career spent largely inside the mediated distances of film and television. This is not the shape of a career winding down. It is the shape of a career that has widened its definition of what the work is for. A shift from proving what he could carry on screen to making sure the next generation never has to prove it entirely alone. None of it read as diminishment. It read as continuation, the same instrument finding new rooms to work in, and a door once open for him now being held open deliberately for somebody else. He was told he was too dark to be seen clearly on screen. He built one of the most visible careers in the history of American character acting. More than 200 screen appearances, a voice recognized on 5 continents, a face 4 decades of audiences have never forgotten, without ever being handed the lead role he had spent his entire career proving he was capable of carrying. Both of those things are true at once. Neither one cancels the other. The record itself is not complicated to state. A debut in 1981, more than 200 credits across film and television spanning over 4 decades. Chauncey in Menace II Society, Cuddy in Dead Presidents, Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Lord Selma, Pinky in Next Friday and Friday After Next, Best Actor for Civil Brand at the American Black Film Festival South Beach, Jeff Brown in Ray, and an NAACP Image Award nomination that finally put a formal industry citation beside his name. The voice of Big Smoke in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, now recognized in the history of interactive media itself. 6 seasons as Rex Fisher on Saints and Sinners. Years as Uncle Lou Duncan on The Family Business. Directing credits on Chase Street. 2 acting workshops built for the next generation. A touring stage production carrying the craft back to where it started. What that list cannot capture is the specific weight of continuing to show up to the set, to the audition room, to the workshop chair, to the touring production, after being told more than once that the face he had been given was too much for the room to hold. No credit line measures that. No award citation holds it. The young people who sat in those workshop chairs and heard him say that a door had once been opened for him and that this was exactly why he was standing at this one now are the real measure of what it cost and what it built. Both things being true at once is not a contradiction that needs resolving. It is simply the accurate shape of a life spent doing extraordinary work inside a system that had already decided, long before it ever saw him audition, what kind of extraordinary it was willing to reward at the very top. Powell did not spend his career waiting for that system to change its mind. He spent it building something the system could not fully account for and in the end could not take back. It comes back in the end to Mayfair Mansions, to Northeast Washington, D.C., to a boy who dreamed of football until a school play answered something the game never could. The stage gave him a language, and he has been speaking it ever since. On film screens, on television, in the air of a Boston Conservatory classroom, and in the digital memory of a game played by 50 million people who may never know his name, but will never forget his voice. Clifton Powell gave the screen more than 200 performances. He gave it proof that the industry's definition of who belongs at the center of a story is not the final word on who actually carries it. He gave it a man who was told his darkness would frighten people, and who spent 40 years becoming the one audiences remembered when the credits rolled and the lights came back up. The lead is not always the one who stays with you. Sometimes it is the one in the corner of the frame, very still, very quiet, waiting for his moment, and making it count completely. The boy from Mayfair Mansions who walked into a school play and found the thing he had been looking for, without a name for it yet, is still in every frame he has ever stood inside. He never left. If Clifton Powell was part of the screen you grew up watching, if you know the whisper, the stillness, the face the industry once tried to tell you was too much, leave a tribute below. Not only for the 200 films, for the ones who showed up every day anyway. Honor that with a like and a subscribe for more stories of people who built something lasting in the space the world left open for them.